The bills were bundled in rubber bands, hundreds mostly, with some 50s at the edges of each stack, packed into a blue nylon duffel bag that had been wedged behind a false panel in the forward wall of the trailer, between the insulation and the aluminum skin, in a gap that someone had cut deliberately and resealed well enough that you wouldn't find it, unless you were looking, or unless the seal failed the way this one did, on the I-90 westbound in Montana at 4:30 in the morning, when the temperature outside was 11 degrees and the trailer had been contracting in the cold for 6 hours, and the panel had worked itself loose and dropped onto the load floor with a sound I heard from the cab. I pulled over at the next exit, walked back, opened the rear doors, swept the load with my flashlight. The panel was on the floor. The gap in the wall was open. The bag was visible. I stood in the doorway of that trailer for maybe 30 seconds, the cold coming in hard, the Montana dark total in every direction except the faint orange smear of a town maybe 15 miles south. And I thought about my father. That's where this story starts. Not with the money, with my father, and with everything he built, and with the question I'd been avoiding for 3 years about how he built it. My name is Dale Morrow. I'm 51 years old. I've been driving commercially since I was 24, which means 27 years. Which means I started the year my father handed me the keys to a truck and said, "You want to learn this business? You learn it from the seat, not from the office." The company was called Morrow Freight. His name was on the door. My name is on the door now. Has been for 3 years, since the funeral in Billings in November, which was attended by more people than I expected and fewer people than he deserved, which is the kind of thing you think at funerals when you're the one who's supposed to be holding it together. I'm going to tell you something before I go further, because this story requires it. I loved my father. I want to be clear about that before I tell you what I found, because the finding changes the way a certain kind of person hears everything else, and I need you to understand the sequence. Love first, then the discovery, then the question that comes after, which is the one I've been driving with for the last 14 months. If you've ever inherited something from someone you loved, not just property, not just money, but the thing they built with their hands and their years, and then found out that the building had rooms you didn't know about, you understand what this story is. If that hasn't happened to you, stay with me anyway, because the road has a way of teaching things that other situations don't. And what the I-90 in Montana at 4:30 in the morning taught me about my father is something I couldn't have learned anywhere else. Subscribe before I go further, because this is the story I've told least and thought about most, and I'm only going to tell it once. My father started Morrow Freight in 1981 with one truck, a lease on a storage unit in Billings, and a list of contacts he'd built in 8 years of driving for other people. He was 32 years old. I was 7. I don't have many memories of him from that period that aren't connected to trucks. The smell of diesel that came off his jacket, the way the kitchen table was always covered in manifests and route maps, the phone calls at dinner that he always took, because in the early years of a freight operation there is no such thing as an after hours. By the time I was old enough to drive, Morrow Freight had 11 trucks and 4 full-time drivers and contracts with 3 regional shippers in Montana and Wyoming. Not large by industry standards, solid. The kind of operation that doesn't make anyone rich, but that doesn't disappear either, because it's built on relationships and reliability rather than on volume and margin. My father knew every shipper personally. He drove himself 2 or 3 times a week, even when the operation was big enough that he didn't need to, because he said you lose the feel of the business when you stop touching the freight. I inherited that from him, the need to keep driving. My wife, Carol, has told me more than once that I use the road the way other people use a drink, that it's the place I go when the office gets too loud and the decisions get too heavy. She's not wrong. After my father died and I took over the operation and the paperwork tripled overnight, I put more miles on myself than I had in years, just to have somewhere to put the noise. The Montana Run is one I take personally when I can. I-90 westbound from Billings, up through the Yellowstone corridor, into the high country where the road cuts through terrain that doesn't apologize for anything. Rock faces, river valleys, the kind of sky that makes you aware of your own scale. My father built his first regular route on this corridor. He drove it for 15 years before he trusted anyone else with it. When I drive it now, I'm not being sentimental, or maybe I am, but it also happens to be good business. A timber products shipper out of Billings, who's been with Morrow Freight since 1987, and who I will not lose as long as I keep showing up. The load that night was timber hardware. Fasteners, brackets, structural connectors, the kind of freight that's dense and heavy and packs cleanly and doesn't require special handling. 42,000 pounds, balanced correctly, legal on every axle. The shipper was a man named Gene Pulaski, second generation, whose father had shaken hands with my father on the first contract in 1987. Gene and I don't discuss rates much anymore. We discuss fishing and grandchildren and the price of fuel, and then we shake hands and I take his freight, and that's the whole relationship, which has survived 37 years and 2 generations and will survive more. I want to tell you about the conversation with Gene after the investigation, because it's the conversation I wasn't sure I was going to be able to have. Gene Pulaski found out about his trailer the same way he found out about everything connected to the investigation, through Paul Greer, who called him as a professional courtesy before the formal notification arrived, so that Gene heard it from a person rather than from paperwork. Gene called me an hour after Greer's call. I answered on the first ring. Gene was 64 years old and had been doing business with Morrow Freight since his father handed him the operation, and he understood the freight industry well enough to understand exactly what a false compartment in a trailer meant. He didn't ask me to explain it. He asked me one question. "Did you know?" "No," I said. A pause. Long enough that I counted it, maybe 8 seconds. "Your father?" he said. "Yes." Another pause. "When did it stop?" "We think 2018. The accounting trails off there." He was quiet again. I could hear him breathing, not agitated breathing, the breathing of a man who is processing something carefully before he decides how to respond to it. Gene Pulaski was not a man who spoke before he was ready. "Dale," he said finally, "I've been doing business with your family since 1987. Your father shook my father's hand on a rate that was fair to both of us, and he kept that rate for 8 years before either of them renegotiated, which in this industry is not something that happens. That's the man I knew." A pause. I don't know what else he was. That's not my business to know. I didn't say anything for a moment. "The trailer," I said. "I'm sorry about the trailer." "The trailer's 30 years old," he said. "It was due for replacement anyway." Another pause. "Are you going to be okay?" I thought about what okay meant in the context of everything I'd been carrying since Leah's report. "The company's going to make it," I said. "I know that," he said. "I'm asking about you." That's the kind of question that Gene Pulaski asks, which is one of the reasons his father and my father shook hands in 1987, and neither of them let go. "I think so," I said. "Yes." "Good." A beat. "I'll see you at the yard in 2 weeks. Usual load." Usual load. 2 words that meant we're continuing. The handshake holds 37 years, and a false compartment and a federal investigation, and we're continuing. I don't have a better description of what loyalty in the freight business looks like than those 2 words from Gene Pulaski. I said I'll be there, and I was. I loaded in Billings at 10 p.m. standard procedure. I walk the load, I check the weight tickets, I seal the trailer myself, I note the seal number in the log. I've done this so many times that the sequence is below conscious thought, the way breathing is below conscious thought. You do it because you do it, and because the day you stop is the day something gets through that shouldn't. Nothing felt wrong at the loading dock. The freight was what Jean said it was. The weight was correct. The seal went on at 10:47 p.m., and I logged the number and pulled out of the Pulaski yard at 11:02. The I-90 westbound out of Billings at 11 at night in January is a specific kind of driving, not difficult exactly, but demanding in the way that cold weather night driving is always demanding, where the road surface requires constant reading and the darkness has a density that daylight doesn't. The temperature had been dropping since sundown, and by midnight the external gauge read 14 degrees. The road was dry, but I could feel the cold in the way the trailer tracked. A slight stiffness, the suspension working differently than it does in moderate temperatures. I kept my speed at 58 and my attention on the road markings, which in the dark and the cold have a specific visibility that requires you to work slightly harder to read them than you'd think. The CB was quiet for the first 2 hours. That stretch of the I-90 in Montana at that hour in January is not heavily trafficked. A few long-haul trucks running the corridor, maybe a couple of overnight runs to Missoula, but mostly the road is yours, which is either the best thing about this job or the loneliest, depending on what you're carrying inside the cab. What I was carrying that night was 3 years of questions I hadn't asked. I want to tell you what those questions were, because they weren't abstract. They were specific, and they'd been specific since the day I moved into my father's office and opened the drawer of his desk and found, underneath a stack of fuel receipts from 2019, a folded piece of paper with 4 phone numbers written in his handwriting and no names beside any of them. I didn't know what to do with those numbers. I held the paper for a while, then put it back in the drawer, then moved the drawer's contents to a box I labeled Administrative, MISC, which is where things go when you don't know what category they belong to. The box is still in the storage room off the main office. I haven't thrown it away, and I haven't gone back through it. That's a form of decision, I understand that. But the numbers were the first thing. The first time I stood in a room that had been my father's room and felt the presence of something I couldn't see clearly. The second thing was a run in the spring of my first year running the company, a Montana corridor load that Jean had confirmed, routine freight, standard manifest. I was driving it myself because I drove the Montana corridor myself whenever I could, partly for the business reason and partly for the reason Carol had named accurately. Somewhere past Columbus, I'd noticed that the trailer was tracking slightly heavy on the rear axles. Not illegally heavy, within tolerance, but heavier than the weight ticket suggested it should be. I'd noted it, checked the distribution at the next stop, found nothing obviously wrong and attributed it to the way the load had settled. Equipment does that. Weight shifts. You log it and move on. I'd moved on. That spring run was 2 years before Leah's report. I know that now. I didn't know it then, because I wasn't looking for it then. I was learning a business, managing a transition, putting miles on the road to keep my head clear. The rear axle weight and the folded paper with 4 numbers went into the same uncategorized space where things go when you're too busy to examine them properly, and you tell yourself you'll come back to it. You always tell yourself you'll come back to it. What I was carrying on the I-90 that January night, in the specific way that you carry something on a long, quiet run when there's no traffic and no CB and nothing between you and the road but the engine noise and the cold, was the awareness that I'd been not looking for 3 years, not looking at the numbers, not looking at the axle weight, not looking at the frequency of the Montana runs in my father's personal log from the late 90s, which I'd read once when I inherited the binders and not read again. Not asking Sandra the questions that were available to ask before she retired. 3 years of choosing the version of the story that required less examination. The I-90 at midnight in January is not a road that lets you not look. It's too empty and too dark, and the distance is too long. At some point on a road like that, whatever you've been carrying comes forward, because there's nothing else to put in front of it. The panel fell at 4:31 a.m. By then, I'd already been awake with the questions for 4 hours. Let me tell you about the bookkeeper. Her name was Sandra Fitch. She'd worked for Morrow Freight for 19 years, from 2001 until my father died, and she stayed on for 8 months after I took over before telling me she was retiring. She was 63, she said, and her husband was in poor health and she needed to be home. I understood that. I thanked her for 19 years, threw her a small party at the office, and hired a firm out of Billings to handle the books going forward. The firm out of Billings found the first discrepancy 6 weeks after Sandra Fitch retired. It wasn't large, a routing inconsistency in accounts receivable, a payment that had been logged against the wrong shipper code for what appeared to be several years running. The accountant who found it, a careful young woman named Leah, flagged it in a note at the bottom of a quarterly report that I almost didn't read all the way through. I read it. I asked her what it meant. She said she wasn't sure yet, that she'd need to look further back. She looked further back. The picture that emerged over the following 3 months was not a simple one. There were accounts that didn't correspond to any shipper in our active files. Payments received from entities I didn't recognize. Loads that had been logged as completed on routes that, when I checked against the physical logbooks, my father had kept paper logs his entire career, every run documented in his handwriting in a set of binders that I'd moved from his office to mine without opening, didn't match the manifests. Some loads had been logged as carrying freight they couldn't have been carrying, given the weights and the routes. Some routes had legs that didn't connect to any legitimate shipper. And the money that came in through the unrecognized accounts, had been handled in a way that was designed to move through the books without attracting attention, mixed into the regular revenue in amounts small enough that no single entry looked wrong, but that over years added up to something that had a shape. I sat with Leah's final report for 3 days before I showed it to anyone else. 3 days of driving, the Montana run, a Wyoming run, a loop through the Dakotas, sitting with what I knew and what I didn't know, trying to find the version of the story that let my father be who I thought he was. I didn't find that version. Those 3 days of driving with Leah's report are not easy to describe, because what I was doing wasn't thinking. Thinking implies a process that moves toward a conclusion. What I was doing was sitting with something in the way you sit with an injury before you decide how bad it is. You move carefully, you test the weight, you find out which movements hurt and which ones you can manage. The Wyoming run goes south from Billings on the I-90 and then cuts down through the Bighorn Basin on US 14, which is a road that in late autumn has a specific quality. Dry grass on both sides, the bighorns on the western horizon, the sky that wide flat blue that Wyoming does in November when the weather is clear. I've driven it probably 60 times. It's not a complicated run, which is why I chose it for those 3 days. I needed a road that would let me think, and the Bighorn Basin in November doesn't demand much. I pulled off at a rest area south of Grable on the second day and sat with the engine running and Leah's report on my phone, and the Bighorn River, visible a 1/4 mile to the east, moving through its canyon the way it always moves, which is without any particular acknowledgement of what's happening on the road above it. I read the report again, for the 4th time. I'd read it once when Leah delivered it and twice during the first day of driving. This 4th reading was different because by then the shock had settled enough that I could read it for what it said, rather than for what I hoped it didn't say. What it said was precise. Leah was a precise person, and the report reflected that. Specific account numbers, specific dates, specific amounts. The pattern laid out in a sequence that was impossible to misread once you were reading it clearly. My father's operation had been thorough. The amounts per run had been kept small. Never more than 120,000 in any single trailer, usually less, and the intervals had been irregular enough that no pattern was obvious from any single year's data. You had to look across years, which is what Leah had done, and when you looked across years, the shape was unmistakable. I sat at that rest area for 40 minutes. A couple of other trucks pulled in and pulled out during that time, a flatbed running north, a refrigerated van with Wyoming plates heading south. Neither of them knew what was in the truck at Pump 3, which was everything and nothing at the same time. What I was trying to work out, the version of the story I was looking for, was the version where my father had done what he'd done for reasons that made him still the man I knew. Not innocent, because the evidence didn't allow for innocent, but understandable, caught in something he couldn't get out of, or protecting something he had no other way to protect, or making a calculation under pressure that most people in his position would have made. I found enough of that version to hold on to, not enough to be comfortable with, enough to keep driving. On the third day, I called Paul Greer and told him I needed to talk. What I found instead was the version where my father, at some point in the late 1990s, had made an arrangement with someone I've never identified. An arrangement that used Morrow Freight's trucks and routes and legitimate reputation as a container for moving something that wasn't on any manifest. Not drugs. I want to be clear about that because the investigation that followed established it clearly enough. The loads were cash, transported in concealed compartments built into specific trailers. Not all of them, not most of them, but several that had been quietly modified and run on specific routes at specific intervals for what Leah's accounting suggested was close to 20 years. My father had been a money courier, not a trafficker, not a criminal in the way that word calls up a specific image. A man who had taken money from people who needed it, moved without documentation, and had moved it carefully in the gaps of a legitimate freight operation for 20 years without getting caught. He died in November, in a hospital in Billings, of a cardiac event that his doctor said was sudden and without prolonged suffering, which is the thing you hold on to when the other things become too much to hold. He was 73. He had, as far as I could determine, stopped the arrangement sometime around 2018. The last unrecognized account payment was in that year, which I think means he stopped, though I don't know why. Maybe the people he worked for stopped needing him. Maybe he stopped being willing, I'll never know, because he didn't tell me, and the dead don't answer questions. What they do leave is handwriting. My father kept paper logs his entire career, not because he was required to. The ELD mandate came in long before he retired, and Morrow Freight ran compliant electronic logs for the whole fleet. He kept paper logs in addition, in parallel, because he said the electronic system recorded what happened, and the paper log was where he thought about what happened. Two different functions. He never explained that distinction further, and I never pressed it because it seemed like something personal to his process and none of my business. After he died, I moved the binders from his office to mine. 14 binders, spanning from 1981 to 2019, each one labeled on the spine in his handwriting with the year and the quarter. I put them on the shelf behind my desk where I could see them, and I told myself I'd go through them when things slowed down, which in the freight business means never, which means I was telling myself I'd never go through them. After Leah's report, I went through them, not all 14 at once. I started with the late 90s, 1997, 1998, 1999, because that's where Leah's accounting suggested the arrangement had started, and I wanted to see what my father's handwriting looked like in that period, what the logs recorded, whether there was anything visible in the entries that corresponded to what Leah had found in the numbers. There was. Not obviously. Not in a way that would have meant anything to someone who didn't know what they were looking for. But once you knew the shape of the arrangement, the specific routes, the intervals, the trailers, the logs showed a pattern of notations that didn't correspond to the standard entry format my father used everywhere else. Small things. a mileage total that didn't match the route, a delivery time logged earlier than the route's distance would have allowed, a trailer number appearing on a Montana run that, cross-referenced against the fleet records, had been acquired second-hand 6 months earlier and had no prior history in the logs. His handwriting in those entries was the same as his handwriting everywhere else. That's the thing that stayed with me, not agitated, not hurried, not different in any way that you could point to and say, here is where he was uncomfortable. The same deliberate script, the same pressure on the pen, the same way he formed the number 7 with a crossbar, the way Europeans do, a habit he'd picked up somewhere and never lost. I sat at his desk, in his chair, reading his handwriting by the light of the desk lamp that had been his desk lamp, and I tried to understand how a man writes a lie in the same hand he writes a truth. The answer I arrived at, which I'm not sure is the right answer but is the one I have, he didn't think of it as a lie. He thought of it as a separate ledger. The paper log was where he thought about what happened. That's what he'd said. And what happened on those runs, in his accounting of it, was that the freight was moved and the delivery was made and the route was completed. The other thing, the bag in the wall, the cash, the arrangement, was in a different column, one he didn't write down. The binders are still on the shelf behind my desk, all 14 of them. I haven't moved them. The panel fell at 4:31 a.m., somewhere between Billings and Livingston, at mile marker 392. I pulled over. I walked back. I found the bag. $94,000 in cash, bundled in rubber bands, in a trailer I had loaded myself from a shipper my father had contracted with in 1987, on a route my father had built and driven for 15 years, and handed to me like a gift. I stood in the doorway of that trailer for 30 seconds, then I closed the doors, walked back to the cab, sat down, put both hands on the wheel. The Montana dark was total in every direction, except that orange smear to the south, which might have been Columbus or might have been nothing, just a refinery running through the night. The temperature was 11 degrees, the engine was running, the heater was working. I sat there for maybe 10 minutes without moving. Then I picked up my phone and called Leah. It was 4:30 in the morning. She answered on the 4th ring, groggy, and I said, I found something in one of the trailers, and I need you to connect me to the attorney we spoke to in January. She was awake by the time I finished the sentence. How much? She said. 94,000. A pause. I'll make the call, she said. Don't move the trailer. I didn't move the trailer. I sat in the cab on the shoulder of the I-90 in Montana at 4:30 in the morning, with 11 degrees outside and my father's name on the door of the truck, and I waited. The attorney's name was Paul Greer. He called me at 5:15. I told him what I had and where I was. He told me what to do, which was stay with the vehicle, don't open the trailer again, and wait for the sheriff's deputy he was going to contact in Stillwater County. He told me it was going to be a long morning. I told him I had nowhere to be. The deputy arrived at 6:07. He was a young man, maybe 30, with the careful professionalism of someone who had been briefed before arrival and understood the situation was not straightforward. He was respectful. He didn't treat me like a suspect, which I appreciated and which Greer had apparently made clear was the appropriate posture. The deputy arrived at 6:07. He was a young man, maybe 30, with the careful professionalism of someone who had been briefed before arrival and understood the situation was not straightforward. He was respectful. He didn't treat me like a suspect, which I appreciated and which Greer had apparently made clear was the appropriate posture. But between Paul Greer's call at 5:15 and the deputy's arrival at 6:07, I had 52 minutes on the shoulder of the I-90 in 11-degree Montana cold, and I want to tell you what those 52 minutes were like, because they're the part of this story that I've never fully described to anyone. I didn't stay in the cab the whole time. After about 20 minutes of sitting still, I got out because the cab had started to feel too small, and the silence had started to feel like something I needed to move through rather than sit in. I walked to the rear of the trailer and stood there with the doors closed, my breath fogging in the flashlight beam, looking at the spot on the door where the seal was logged at 10:47 the previous night in my own handwriting. The seal was still intact. I had checked it before I called Greer, and I hadn't touched it since. Whatever was inside, the bag, the money, the gap in the wall, was exactly as I'd found it, documented and undisturbed, which is what Paul Greer had told me the situation required. I stood there in the cold and thought about all the times my father had sealed a trailer. He'd sealed thousands. I'd watched him do it hundreds of times. The deliberate motion, the log entry, the number recorded. It was a ritual that meant, the freight is correct, I am responsible for it, this is my word on the load. Every driver learns that ritual, and most drivers perform it without thinking. My father performed it with attention, every time, because he believed in the ritual the way some people believe in a handshake, not as a formality, but as a commitment. He had also, for 20 years, sealed trailers that contained things he didn't log. I stood on the shoulder of the I-90 in Montana at 5 in the morning and tried to hold both of those things at the same time. The man who meant the ritual and the man who violated it. And I couldn't make them into one person in a way that was comfortable. And eventually I stopped trying, because some truths don't become comfortable no matter how long you stand in the cold with them. A semi-past going westbound, its lights sweeping the pullout for a second. And I watched it go and thought, that driver knows nothing about what's parked on this shoulder, which is how it should be, which is how most of the world operates. In the absence of information about the weight other people are carrying, you pass someone on the I-90 at 5 in the morning and you have no idea. That's normal. That's the road. I went back to the cab at 5:50 and turned the heat up and drank the last of the coffee from the thermos, which was cold. I looked at my father's photograph on the visor. I keep one there, the same way I always have. A man behind the wheel in 1989, grinning, and I said out loud to the cab and to him and to nobody, I found it. Then the deputy's headlights appeared at the on-ramp. I handed him everything I had, the manifest, the seal log, my personal log, Leah's report, which I'd forwarded to my phone months ago and had been carrying with me ever since, without fully knowing why. He took the bag from the trailer. $94,000. It went into evidence. The trailer went into a lot in Billings, pending the investigation. Gene Pulaski was contacted, and his shock appeared genuine. The compartment had been built into that specific trailer years before Gene's relationship with Morrow Freight began, and there was no indication he had any knowledge of it. The investigation found 2 other trailers in the Morrow fleet with similar modifications. Both were older units that my father had acquired second-hand in the late 1990s. Both had been run on the Montana corridor. My father had been dead for 3 years before any of this came to light. He couldn't be charged. He couldn't be asked. He couldn't explain himself, and I couldn't give him the chance to. And that is the part of this that I've spent 14 months living with, in the specific way you live, with something you can't put down and can't carry any further. Let me tell you about the drivers. Because the investigation didn't happen in a vacuum, and the people most affected by it, after me, after Carol, were the 4 men and 1 woman who drove for Morrow Freight, and who showed up to the yard one Tuesday morning in February to find 2 federal vehicles parked at the entrance and a notice on the door saying operations were temporarily suspended pending review. Their names were Phil, Darnell, Karen, Tim, and Eddie. Phil had been with the company for 11 years. Darnell, 8. Karen, 6. Tim and Eddie were newer, 3 years and 18 months, respectively. None of them had any knowledge of the arrangement. The investigation established that clearly and quickly, which was one of the few things in that period that went faster than expected. But cleared and unaffected are different things, and for 3 weeks, while the investigation worked through the fleet and the books, those 5 people had no income and no certainty about whether the company they'd built their working lives around was going to exist at the end of it. I called each of them personally. Not in a group, individually, one at a time, because what they deserved was a direct conversation, not a conference call where they couldn't ask what they actually needed to ask. Vil was the hardest call. He'd known my father since before I'd started driving. He'd been at the funeral. He sat on the other end of the phone for a long time after I told him what I could tell him, which was limited by the investigation's parameters. And then he said, "Is the company going to make it?" I said, "Yes," he said. "Then I'll be here when you open back up." He was. They all were. On the first Monday after operations resumed, all 5 trucks were in the yard, and all 5 drivers showed up. And Phil made a point of shaking my hand at the door, not saying anything, just the handshake. And I understood exactly what it meant. And I didn't say anything either, because some things don't need language. I gave each of them 3 weeks of back pay for the suspension period. The company could barely afford it. I didn't ask anyone's opinion about whether it was the right financial decision. It was the right decision. The financial part was my problem to solve. In March, 2 months after the discovery, I drove up to Roundup. My father's younger brother, my Uncle Walt, still lives there. He's 78, slower than he used to be, with the specific stillness of a man who has lived in the same county his entire life and has stopped needing to explain himself to anyone. He and my father were close in the way that brothers are close when they've grown up hard together and then spent 50 years living differently, not in constant contact, but with the understanding that the contact is always available. Walt knew my father better than I did in certain ways. He knew the version of my father that existed before Morrow Freight, before me, before the debt and the arrangement and the 20 years of quiet navigation. He knew the young man who grew up in Roundup in the 1950s and decided that the way out was work, and the work that made sense was moving things. I sat at Walt's kitchen table for 3 hours. I told him what I knew. He listened the way old men listen when they're not surprised, not unmoved, but not surprised. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "How bad is it for the company?" "We'll make it," I said. "Good." He poured more coffee. He worried about that company every day of his life, more than he worried about anything else. I know. More than he worried about you sometimes? Walt said it carefully, not as criticism, as fact. He thought if the company was okay, everything else would be okay. That was his logic. His logic was wrong, I said. I know that. He might have known it too by the end. Walt looked at his coffee. Your father was not a man who asked for help. You know that. I know. When things got bad in the late 90s, I knew they were bad. I could see it when I looked at him. I asked him once if he needed anything. Money, contacts, whatever I could do. He shook his head. He said he had it handled. He had it handled. I drove back to Billings from Roundup on the US 87, which goes south through country that's flat and wide, and in March has the specific color of a land that's been under snow for 4 months and is just beginning to remember what it was before winter. The sky was doing what Montana skies do in early spring, enormous and grey-white, the kind of sky that makes the land look small and the distances look manageable, and the actual distances turn out to be larger than they appeared. I drove it without the CB on, just the road and the engine and the flat country, and Walt's voice saying he said he had it handled. The company survived. Morrow Freight is still operating, which required a period of cooperation with the investigation and a restructuring of the accounts, and a level of transparency with existing shippers that was uncomfortable and necessary. I lost 2 smaller contracts. I kept Jean Pulaski, which mattered more than the two I lost, because Jean's father had shaken my father's hand in 1987, and Jean called me personally after he was cleared and said, "I know what your father was to this business, and I know what you're trying to do with it, and I'm not going anywhere. I've thought about what my father was doing and why, and I've arrived at the only answer that fits the evidence. He was afraid, not of getting caught. He ran that operation carefully enough that he nearly made it through his entire life without exposure. He was afraid of the business failing, afraid that what he'd built wouldn't survive the margins, the fuel costs, the competition from larger carriers who could operate at scales he couldn't match. He'd found a way to supplement the revenue that felt, to him, like a parallel track, not compromising the legitimate operation, just running alongside it. I don't know if he told himself it was harmless. I don't know if he thought about where the money came from or where it was going. I don't know if he felt what he was doing as wrong in the way I feel it as wrong. I know he drove this road for 15 years and handed it to me and never said a word. I drive it still. The I-90 through Montana, the corridor he built, the sky that doesn't apologize for anything. I drive it in a truck with my name on the door, with a manifest that matches the load, with a seal I log myself, on a route that is exactly what it says it is. The trailer with the false panel is gone, decommissioned, crushed. The other two are gone too. The fleet is clean. The books are clean. Leah's firm has been our accountant for 3 years and has found nothing that she hasn't been able to explain to my satisfaction. At mile marker 392 on the I-90 westbound, there's a pullout on the south shoulder where I stopped that morning. I stop there sometimes when I'm running the corridor. Not every time. Occasionally. I pull over, kill the engine, and sit for 2 or 3 minutes without doing anything. The Montana dark is always the same at that spot. Total cold, the orange smear of a town to the south that I now know is Columbus, 14 miles down a county road, a town my father probably drove past 100 times without stopping. The silence when the engine is off is the kind of silence that requires you to be inside it for a moment before you can hear it correctly. My father's name is still on the door. I've thought about changing it. I haven't. Not because I'm protecting him. The investigation is public record. His name is in documents I can't unsign. But because the name on the door is also the name of what he built, which is real and which runs and which I'm responsible for, and taking his name off the door doesn't change what happened and doesn't make me more honest about it. It just makes the door say something different. At mile marker 392, I sit for 2 or 3 minutes. Then I start the engine and pull back onto the I-90 and make the delivery. The freight is always what the manifest says it is. That's the whole promise. That's what I've got. If you stayed with me all the way through Montana, thank you for that. Drop a comment before you go. If you'd found that bag, what would you have done in the first 10 minutes? Not eventually. In the first 10 minutes, before the attorney, before the logic, I know what I did. I'm not sure everyone would have done the same thing. Subscribe if you aren't already. The next story is a different kind of road, a different driver, a different kind of reckoning. But the cab is always the same size, and the questions you carry in it are always your own. Roll safe. Ajud Butt. I've told this story in pieces before. To Paul Greer, to the investigators, to Carol, who deserved to hear it from me before she heard it from anyone else, and who sat at the kitchen table in Billings with her hands wrapped around a coffee mug and didn't say anything for a long time after I finished, which is how Carol handles things that are too large for an immediate response. She processes first. She talks after. That's always been her way. And it's one of the reasons we've been married for 23 years without destroying each other. What I haven't done is tell it in one piece, from the beginning, because the beginning is where my father is most present, and that's the hardest part to move through without stopping. Let me try. My father's name was Robert Morrow. He was born in 1948 in a town called Roundup, Montana, about 50 miles north of Billings, the second son of a man who ran cattle and a woman who taught school, and between them raised 4 children with the specific combination of discipline and pragmatism that the Montana high country seems to produce in people who grow up there. He was not a complicated man in the way that the word complicated is sometimes used to mean interesting. He was straightforward, direct, not given to abstraction or sentiment. He expressed things through action rather than language. The clearest way I know to say this is, he showed up. In 27 years of driving alongside him and then for him and then after him, the defining characteristic of my father was that he showed up, and the freight was always what the manifest said it was, and the delivery was made on time. That's the man I knew. I understood after Leah's report that the man I knew was accurate and incomplete at the same time. He was those things, the showing up, the reliability, the handshakes that held for 30 years. And he was also something else, something he had never shown me, something he'd run parallel to everything I knew about him for 2 decades. I want to tell you about the years before the arrangement, because I think they matter. Morrow Freight in the late 1990s was in trouble, not the kind of trouble that makes the news, not bankruptcy, not scandal, nothing dramatic. The quiet kind of trouble, which is in some ways harder to manage because it doesn't announce itself clearly. Fuel costs had climbed. A large shipper in Wyoming that had accounted for roughly 30% of our annual revenue had been acquired by a national carrier and had renegotiated its contracts with smaller operators like us at rates that made the routes barely viable. My father had taken on debt to update part of the fleet, newer trucks, better fuel economy. The logic was sound. And the debt service was eating into margins that were already thin. I was in my mid-20s. I knew the company was stressed. My father didn't hide the overall picture from me, but he managed the details himself, and what I saw was the surface, the routes running, the drivers paid, the lights on in the office. The water was coming in below the waterline, and he was bailing it himself quietly, without asking for help or indicating that help was needed. Somewhere in that period, 1998 or 1999, Leah's analysis suggested, someone made my father an offer. I don't know who. The investigation didn't establish that, and I haven't tried to find out beyond what the investigators found, because the people who make that kind of offer to a struggling freight operator in rural Montana are not people whose identity I need to possess. What I know is that the offer was structured to be invisible. Specific trailers, specific routes, specific intervals, small enough amounts per run that no single delivery would attract attention. The payment came through the layered accounts that Sandra Fitch managed, absorbed into the revenue stream in a way that required someone with her particular combination of skill and discretion to maintain. Sandra Fitch. I've thought about Sandra more than I've thought about almost anyone else in this story, which might seem strange given that my father is the center of it. But Sandra is the one I can still reach, theoretically. She's retired, she's in Billings, and she knows things that my father took with him and that she chose to carry on her own. I have not contacted her. Paul Greer advised against it during the investigation. She was technically a subject of interest, and any contact from me could have complicated things. And by the time the investigation closed, I had decided that what Sandra knew was hers to keep or tell as she chose, and that I wasn't going to be the person who made that choice for her. She hasn't contacted me either. I don't expect her to. What I believe, and I want to be clear that this is belief, not evidence, is that Sandra Fitch understood exactly what she was maintaining and made a calculation that was not entirely different from my father's, that the business surviving was worth the arrangement, that the arrangement was careful enough to be invisible, and that her job, her 19 years, her salary, her retirement, all of it depended on the company staying alive in those difficult years when the legitimate revenue Wasn't enough. She's not a villain in this story. Neither is my father. That's what makes it hard to carry. In January of the year my father died, 3 months before the cardiac event, I drove the Montana Run with him. He was quiet for most of the first 2 hours. That wasn't unusual. My father had always been a quiet passenger, the kind of man who treated riding in someone else's truck as an opportunity to observe rather than to talk. He watched the road, watched the mirrors, watched the way I handled the grades and the lane changes with the attentiveness of a man who was still, at 72, evaluating. Around Laurel, about 20 miles out of Billings, he said, "You've got a good feel for this rig?" "It's my rig," I said. "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "I mean the weight distribution, how you're managing the rear axles on the grade. Your father taught you that." He said your father the way old men sometimes do when talking about themselves, as if the younger version of themselves was a different person, which maybe it was. I let it sit. "He did," I said. We passed through the canyon section west of Columbus, where the Yellowstone runs close to the road and the rock walls come in from the north. In January, they're sheeted with ice in the crevices, the rock face dark and wet where the ice is melting in the afternoon sun, and the river is low and clear and moving without hurry. My father had shown me this stretch when I was a child. He used to say, "This is where Montana tells you what it actually is. Not the mountains, not the big sky. This canyon. It's old, and it doesn't care." He looked at it as we passed through, the same way he'd always looked at it. "How's the Pulaski account?" he said. "Good. Gene just renegotiated for another 3 years." He nodded. "His father was a fair man. He is too." "Yes. Don't lose that account, Dale." I looked at him, just briefly, the way you look at a passenger when something in their voice is different from what the words say. His voice had the quality of someone giving instruction that they mean more seriously than the surface of it. "I won't," I said. He nodded once and looked back at the road. I've thought about that moment since Leah's report. The Pulaski account, the trailer that had the false compartment, the run my father had built and driven and handed to me. Whether he was telling me not to lose the account because it was good business or because he knew what was in that trailer and wanted me to keep running it without looking too closely. I've sat with that question for a long time. I don't have an answer. I'm not sure I'm entitled to one. What I know is that he said don't lose that account with the weight of a man who had reasons I didn't understand yet. And that when I told Gene I'd be at the yard in 2 weeks, I was keeping both promises at once, my father's and my own. And only one of them was clean. That's the kind of accounting the road doesn't have a column for. He didn't usually ride along anymore. He was 72. His health was declining in the quiet way that some men's health declines, where they don't complain and you don't fully register how much has changed until you look at them in a particular light. I invited him because Carol had suggested it, because she saw something in him that I wasn't seeing, which was that he was trying to say something and didn't have the language for it. He sat in the passenger seat for 8 hours and said almost nothing out of the ordinary. We talked about the company, the Pulaski contract, a new shipper I was considering in Missoula, fuel prices. We talked about Carol and the kids. We stopped at a truck stop in Columbus for coffee, and he stood at the window and looked at the Yellowstone River for longer than I'd ever seen him look at anything. I asked him what he was thinking. "Just looking," he said. "That's all. I've gone back over that drive 100 times since Leah's report, looking for the thing he was trying to say and didn't. Looking for the moment where he came close, and then didn't, and what I might have done differently to open the door. I've never found a satisfying answer. Maybe there was no such moment. Maybe he'd made his peace with it in his own way. The arrangement ended, the company stabilized, the money was in the books, and Sandra was managing it, and the years were passing, and nobody was coming to the door. Maybe he thought it was behind him, Or maybe he was standing at that window in Columbus looking at the Yellowstone River because some part of him knew I was going to find out eventually. And he was trying to figure out how to start a sentence he'd never been able to start in 72 years. I don't know. I'll never know. What I know is that 3 months later I was in Billings, in the hospital, in a room that smelled like antiseptic and the particular quiet of a place where people are waiting for something inevitable. And my father died with his hand in my hand and nothing left unsaid because neither of us said anything. We just sat in that room together while the monitors did what monitors do, and the November dark came in through the window and settled over everything. I held his hand until it wasn't warm anymore. The 8 months between my father's death and Sandra Fitch's retirement were the hardest months I've had in this business, and I want to be clear that I'm including the months after the discovery in that comparison. What came after the discovery was difficult in ways that had a name. Those 8 months were difficult in ways that didn't yet. I was running a freight company I'd watched from the outside my entire adult life, and was now inside, and the inside was different from what the outside had suggested. Not worse, different. My father had managed the operation with a degree of personal control that meant very little was documented in ways that survived him. Relationships that existed because he existed. Rates that were handshake rates, not contract rates. Scheduling logic that lived in his head and in Sandra's files and nowhere else. Sandra was patient with me. I want to say that clearly. Whatever she knew, whatever she was managing, she was patient and thorough, and she trained me on the books with the care of someone who understood that the business needed to survive the transition. She stayed late when I needed her to. She answered questions I was embarrassed to ask. She never made me feel that I was less than my father at this, even on the days when I clearly was. I've thought about that a lot since Leah's report. The patience, the thoroughness, the late evenings in the office, whether those were Sandra being a good employee or Sandra ensuring the books remained opaque enough that a new owner doing a cursory review wouldn't find the architecture she'd spent years building. I don't know the answer. Both things can be true. People contain more than one motivation at a time, and Sandra Fitch had 19 years of reasons to keep Morrow Freight running, and some of them were legitimate and some of them were not. And she managed both with the same capable hands. When she told me she was retiring, I was relieved. I don't say that to implicate her. I was relieved because I'd been planning to bring in an outside firm anyway, because the books needed fresh eyes after a transition, and Sandra's retirement made that conversation unnecessary. I threw her the party. I thanked her genuinely, and then I hired Leah's firm. And 6 weeks later the first discrepancy surfaced, and the 8 months of patient training began to look different in retrospect. I have not spoken to Sandra Fitch since the investigation closed. I don't intend to. What she knows is hers to carry, and what I know is mine, and the space between those two things is where my father lived for 20 years, without telling either of us the whole picture. That's the thing about inheritance. You don't just inherit the assets, you inherit the architecture, the walls that were built to hold certain things in and certain things out. And you live in that architecture for a while before you understand what the rooms were for. Then I went home and called the funeral home and called my siblings and called Gene Pulaski, because Gene had known my father for 30 years and I thought he deserved to hear it directly. Gene said he was a good man and he built something real and you're going to do right by it. He said it with the certainty of someone who'd watched a lot of things not last and recognized the difference. I said, I'm going to try. I meant it. I still mean it. I mean it in the specific way that you mean something when you know it's going to cost you more than you thought it would and you're going to do it anyway. The morning after the discovery, after the deputy and the evidence bag and the attorney and the 2 hours I spent on the shoulder of the I-90 in 11-degree Montana cold, waiting for the investigation to begin, I drove the rest of the run. Gene's freight was transferred to a clean trailer at a yard in Livingston. The delivery in Missoula was 8 hours late. which required a conversation with the receiving manager that I had directly, without explanation beyond equipment issue. He was understanding in the way that people who've worked with Morrow Freight for years tend to be understanding. The account had earned that credit. 24 years of reliable delivery, and one late run didn't touch it. I made the delivery at 3 in the afternoon, backed into Dock 7, watched the unloading, signed the paperwork. The receiving manager, a man named Victor, who I've dealt with 6 or 7 times, shook my hand and said, "Long night?" "Long morning," I said. "Everything okay?" I thought about what to say. The investigation was open. The details were not mine to share. And Victor was asking in the way that people ask when they genuinely want to know, not just as a conversational filler. "Working through something," I said. "The freight is good." He nodded like that was a complete sentence. "In the freight business, it is." I drove back to Billings that evening. Not the I-90. I took the US 212 through the Beartooth foothills, which is longer and slower, and in January requires attention, because the road has its own ideas about what it's going to do. It's also the road my father used to call the real Montana, as opposed to the highway Montana, which he said was fine for freight, but didn't show you anything true about the place. The Beartooth in January at dusk is not subtle. The rock faces are 100 feet from the road on the north side, and the drop on the south side goes down into valleys that in the fading light look like the bottom of something that doesn't have a name. I drove it at 40 miles per hour with the radio off and the CB on low, and the only transmission I caught the whole way was a rancher on a local channel talking to someone about a fence line, which is the kind of CB conversation that makes you aware that there are whole worlds of people conducting whole lives on these frequencies, and none of them are thinking about what you're thinking about. I got back to Billings at 8:30. Carol was awake, which she always is when I'm running late. She had the kitchen light on and a pot of something on the stove, and she looked at me when I came through the door with the specific look that means, "Tell me when you're ready, not before." I sat down at the kitchen table. She put a bowl in front of me. I told her everything, all of it. Leah's report, the attorney, the investigation, the panel, the bag, the $94,000, my father, Sandra Fitch, the accounts, the 20 years. She listened the way Carol listens, completely without interruption, without her face doing the things that some people's faces do when they're deciding how to respond to something before the person has finished saying it. She just listened. When I was done, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Does it change who he was to you?" I thought about that for a while. "No," I said, "but it changes what I know about him, and I can't unknow it." She nodded. "What are you going to do with it?" "What I'm already doing," I said. "Run the company right, keep the freight clean, make the deliveries." She looked at me for a moment. "He'd have said the same thing," she said. And she wasn't being cruel. She was being accurate, and we both knew it. And that's the thing about Carol. She gives you the true thing, even when the true thing is complicated. My father would have said the same thing. Run the company right. Keep the freight clean. He just also did the other thing quietly for 20 years, where he thought no one could see it. I'm at mile marker 392 again as I finish this. Not literally. I'm in the office in Billings, at the desk that was his desk, with the window that looks out at the yard where 7 trucks are parked in various states of readiness for tomorrow's runs. But I'm at that mile marker in the sense that I carry it with me now, the way you carry the places where something changed. The Montana dark is always the same at that spot. 11 degrees, the orange smear to the south, the silence when the engine is off. My father built this company in that country. He drove that road for 15 years and handed it to me, and I still don't know everything it cost him to keep it running, and I'm not sure I want to. What I want, what I'm working toward, run by run, delivery by delivery, is to know everything it takes to keep it running the right way. The freight is what the manifest says it is. That's the inheritance I've chosen to accept. If you came all the way to Billings with me, thank you. Leave a comment before you go. Could you have made the same call in those first 10 minutes on the shoulder, in 11-degree Montana cold, before the attorney and before the logic had time to work? I've asked myself that question every time I pass mile marker 392. Hit subscribe before you leave. The next story is a completely different driver on a completely different road, and the weight they're carrying is nothing like this, but the cab is always the same size. Roll safe.